Hi folks, HR Funk here with the third installment in my Riflescope 101 series, and I'm calling this one Facts, Figures, and Focal Planes because I thought that sounded a little catchier than all other. And with what I'm going to go into in today's video, I'm going to be covering terminology and characteristics associated with rifle scopes that don't really fall into any of my other planned installments in this series, but it's all information that I think is good for anyone who really wants to understand rifle scopes and how they work and how to use them. So let's get right into it. I'm once again going to start at the rear of the scope and work my way forward. And I'm actually going to start with this rearmost lens. And if you saw the first video in this series, you may recall that this is called the ocular lens. And there's a term associated with the ocular lens that I want to define and also discuss for just a minute or two to hopefully dispel some misconceptions about that term. The term is exit pupil. An exit pupil refers to the light coming from the ocular lens that your eye picks up and you perceive as the field of view inside the scope. There's actually a measurement to that exit pupil, and it doesn't come out at the same size, or at least as you move farther and farther from the ocular lens, it's not the same size as the lens itself. In fact, it is a cone-shaped light that emerges from the ocular lens, and we can determine the measurement of that cone by dividing the size of the objective lens in millimeters by the magnification power at which the scope is set. So for a variable power scope, this is going to change. For a fixed power scope, this is always going to be the same. If we have a 50 millimeter objective and a 10 power magnification, then we would divide 50 by 10 and come up with 5 millimeters. Now I've done a little bit of research, and what I've come up with is the human eye, depending upon light conditions, because remember it dilates and constricts, so your pupil gets larger and smaller. The human eye pupil size is between 2 millimeters and 8 millimeters. So if you're outside shooting on a nice sunny day, your pupils are going to constrict, actually your iris is going to constrict, and your pupils are going to be closer to that 2 millimeter size. If you have 5 millimeters of exit pupil for your 2 millimeter pupil to perceive, then it's going to be easy, or at least easier, to see your entire image through the scope when you're shooting. On the other hand, if this was a 20 power scope with that same 50 millimeter objective lens, and we divided 50 millimeters by the 20 power magnification, that comes out to only 2.5 millimeters. So now the exit pupil is much smaller, and this is why as magnification increases, what we perceive as the area of the ocular lens that we can see the entire image through the scope gets narrower and narrower. Now the confusion comes in because some shooters have colloquially started to refer to this as the eye box. There is no box inside of here. There is nothing other than the exit pupil emerging from the ocular lens, and this is why the position of your eye becomes so critical as that exit pupil gets smaller and smaller. Consider this too with some of the scopes nowadays that are going up to 30, 35, 36 power, 40 power, and that's also part of the reason that the objective lens keeps getting bigger and bigger to try to give shooters a usable exit pupil when they are set at those very high magnifications. But even then, we still have that critical eye position behind the ocular lens. This is where something called cheek weld becomes important. Cheek weld refers to the position of the shooter's cheek on the rifle stock in order to achieve that proper eye position behind the ocular lens every single time a shot is fired. Now some shooters will break this down into two different things. They will use the forward to backward position of the shooter's cheek and call that cheek weld, and the up and down position they will refer to as spot weld. I tend to think of that all as one thing. I put it all into the category of cheek weld for both forward and rearward position and upward and downward position. This is also where a rifle like this one that has an adjustable comb can help to make sure that the shooter gets that proper eye position, because this can be adjusted up or down rather than the shooter having to try to hold their cheek in a more uncomfortable position or what have you. This can be adjusted to compensate and make sure the up and down position is correct. This rifle also has an adjustable length of pull, which serves to make sure the shooter's eye forward to back is in that proper position every time, so they can take advantage of the full exit pupil and get a full field of view while looking through the scope. When the shooter has achieved that proper eye position so that they can see the entire field of view through the scope, this is said to be the proper eye relief. And you'll hear this term quite a bit. When we set up the scope and mount it, we need to make sure we get the proper eye relief, so when the shooter has a natural position for their cheek on the stock of the rifle, they get the full field of view when looking through the scope. Something to be aware of with eye relief, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about scope mounting in a later segment, is that the eye relief can change somewhat depending upon the position the shooter is in. If they are seated at a bench, their eye might be in a slightly different position than if they're shooting prone. Or if they're standing, it might be in slightly a different position than if they're shooting from a kneeling supported position. So when we mount the scope and set it up, we need to check it from multiple positions and make sure at all magnification settings we are getting that full image through the ocular lens. Another term you might hear from time to time associated with rifle scopes is twilight factor. Now, twilight factor applies to rifle scopes, but a lot of the things that I'm talking about in this series apply equally to other optics like binoculars or spotting scopes or what have you. If you hear twilight factor, what that is a measurement of the scope's ability to gather light and perform better in low light conditions. There is a way to calculate this, just like there is a way to calculate the exit pupil that I was talking about a moment ago. It involves using a square root, and I'm just not going to go into it. Basically, the higher the twilight factor, the better low light performance that you will get from that optic. But that was a lot more applicable in the days before there were things such as optic coatings. The optic coatings that are used these days have a lot to do with the amount of light transmission we get through the optic while we're using it. Which brings me to another term that we hear very commonly these days, and that is fully multi-coated optics. You see that many times in marketing for scopes or binoculars or what have you, that they have fully multi-coated optics. And what that means is every lens in this scope has optic coatings applied to them. The optic coatings increase the transmission of light through the scope and also help with the clarity of the image. So when I mentioned twilight factor a moment ago, I think nowadays with modern optic coatings, the twilight factor is less important than it was once upon a time, because it is a mechanical measurement of the light coming through the lenses, but it doesn't take into account the optic coatings, and it doesn't take into account the quality of the glass or how well that glass is ground into the form of lenses. All optic coatings are not created equally, and I do not pretend to be an expert in the realm of optic coatings, but what I can tell you is it's my understanding that a lot of the expense associated with the very high-end scopes has to do with the number of optic coatings they receive and the type of optic coatings that are used. As I understand it, just the application process itself to put the coating on the lenses is very expensive. When we look at the objective lens of the scope here, you see that greenish hue, and that is the color that comes from the optic coating or coatings that have been applied to this lens. And we'll see that sometimes it'll have a greenish hue or a bluish hue or sometimes a reddish hue. That all has to do with the optic coatings that have been applied to the lenses, in that scope or those binoculars or what have you. A moment ago I mentioned glass, and there is some exceptional glass being used in rifle scopes these days. We'll see more and more frequently Japanese ELD glass, and ELD stands for extra low dispersion, once again helping to increase that light transmission through the scope and make sure you have a bright image on the receiving end. Also, shot glass from Germany I think is regarded as being pretty much the premier glass used in rifle scopes. Another term you might hear associated with glass lenses is something called chromatic aberration. And chromatic aberration is something that some shooters see behind every lens covers and other shooters don't notice too much at all. Chromatic aberration basically means when you look through the scope around the edges of some of the images, you will see the colors start to separate as though they're going through a prism. Sometimes it'll almost look like a rainbow effect around the edges of some things in your field of view, and you'll see red and green and purple and blue or whatever. And it's a sign of improperly aligned lenses. This has to do with the precision with which the scope is manufactured, but I think this is also something that has a lot to do with your personal tolerance, or maybe just with the types of optics you've used. I think shooters like myself, who were using scopes years ago that were nowhere near the quality of the scopes we have nowadays in terms of the image quality, probably have a pretty high tolerance to chromatic aberration, because we used scopes back in the day that were almost hard to see through. There were dark, murky images with some distorted edges around various things we were looking at. Whereas when we look through a scope these days, even a mid-range scope, it looks pretty good and we're able to go out and shoot. Other shooters will not like that at all. That's something they don't want anything to do with. I had someone ask me in the comments a couple of days ago what I thought was an acceptable level of chromatic aberration, and I really said that's up to the individual shooter and their personal preference. I don't think it bothers me nearly as much as it bothers some other shooters. Parallax. Parallax is something you hear mentioned a lot. You don't hear it defined very often. Parallax is the apparent movement of an object when the shooter's eye moves behind the scope. And I can give you an example of this. If you hold your thumb out like this and find something, I could use probably the scope turret right there if I wanted to in this example, but just find some object on a wall or at some distance away from you and hold your thumb so it is right in the middle of that object or just covering up that object, and keep your thumb stationary and move your eye slightly back and forth, and what you'll see is that object in the distance will appear to move slightly back and forth as your eye is moving. That is parallax. With a rifle scope, if the parallax is bad enough, it can cause the shot to appear to wander on the target. For that reason, a lot of scopes these days have a parallax adjustment, but it's important to understand how to adjust for parallax. Many people think of this just as a focus adjustment, and they dial it to where the focus is sharp and clear. That may be the proper setting for parallax, and the indicator markings on the adjustment might correspond to where parallax is eliminated with this adjustment, or it might not be quite right. The way to check for parallax is to adjust to approximately the distance at which the indicator marks are set. That corresponds to whatever distance you are shooting. Then, while maintaining a steady placement of the rifle, move your eye slightly up and down or back and forth and see if you can detect any movement of your target at all. If you're seeing some movement, then the parallax adjustment is not quite right and you need to try a little bit more or a little bit less, then test again. When you get to the point where the target does not appear to be moving at all, then the parallax is properly set and you're ready to start firing at that distance. I want to make a couple of comments about magnification, because magnification is one of those things that a lot of shooters think more is always better, and that's not necessarily the case. Keep in mind, and I think I mentioned this in the introduction to this series, as magnification increases. The field of view at any distance proportionately decreases. So let's think about a hunter, for example. If the hunter is using a rifle with a scope set on very high magnification, and that hunter sees a game animal somewhere off in the distance, with that tiny field of view, it might be difficult to even find the animal while looking through the scope. The hunter might have to actually turn the magnification back down, find the animal, and then, if necessary, zoom in order to be able to take their shot, or maybe just take the shot on the lower magnification. And I say that because at the lower magnification, the image is probably going to look much steadier. At higher and higher levels of magnification, any movement of the rifle or scope is magnified. And with our hunter, if he does not have an absolutely rock steady hold, then any of that movement might become distracting and could even potentially cause the hunter to miss the shot just because all of a sudden now they're trying to time the trigger pull with that movement and everything else, and that can be problematic. Another issue with magnification that I already talked about has to do with the exit pupil, and as the magnification level gets higher and higher, the shooter's eye behind that ocular lens becomes more and more critical in terms of its position. And this is another thing where if there's a dynamic situation and the shooter has to try to get behind the scope, get a sight picture, and get a shot off quickly, that can be delayed because at that high level of magnification, the shooter is now moving around trying to find the full field of view, looking through the scope, and be able to take that shot. And again, that can be a problem. And also, as magnification increases and that exit pupil becomes smaller and smaller, with some scopes, you will see the image get darker and darker as well. So it's something else to keep in mind. On the plus side, with a scope that is in a very, very steady rest, or maybe I should say with a scope mounted to a rifle that's in a very steady rest, then the higher and higher levels of magnification can allow the shooter to place a shot more precisely. As I said very early on in this series, the scope does not make someone a better shooter. The scope allows a shooter to more precisely place their shot, and assuming that shooter applies all the proper basics of marksmanship, then they should be able to attain a higher degree of accuracy. I hope that all makes sense and that progression is understandable. Tube diameter and objective lens diameter. These are a couple of characteristics that are somewhat related, and they also both tend to get the bigger is always better type of thinking. And maybe to a degree that's true, but you also reach a point of diminishing returns. In general, the larger the tube, the more light that can be transmitted to the shooter's eye to provide a brighter image of whatever is being viewed downrange. Similarly, the larger objective lens gathers more light, and that also helps to increase the brightness of the image, and particularly with the objective lens, that helps out a lot in lower light conditions. But this also adds weight to the scope and it adds bulk to the scope. So again, we get to a point sooner or later where are we getting the benefit with the bigger tube and the bigger lens for our type of shooting, or is it just adding weight and greater dimensions to our optic and really not giving us that much in return? That's something every shooter has to answer for themselves. Now, one other thing you get with a larger tube diameter is a greater area for which the internal erector mechanism of the scope can move, so you tend to get greater and greater elevation and windage adjustment capability when you have a larger tube as opposed to what you get with a smaller tube. Another thing that I want to cover quickly in this segment has to do with the windage and elevation adjustment turrets. And this is another one of those things that really kind of fits into the all others, and it doesn't have a convenient point at some other part of this series where I can get it in. And it has to do with the way these turn. When you see the arrows here that are indicating up, and the direction to go up is in the direction the arrows are turning. What that's telling you is when you turn the turret in that direction, that is the direction the bullet is going to move on the target. So if you want the bullet to move up on the target, you turn the turret in the direction of the arrow that says up. Same thing on the windage turret. You can't see that over here on the other side, but if it says right and you turn it in the direction of right, that's the direction the bullet is going to move on the target. Obviously, if you turn it the opposite direction, the bullet is going to move left on the target. If we turn the elevation turret the opposite of up, the bullet is going to move down on the target. If you've ever seen one of my videos where I'm making scope adjustments with my elevation and windage turrets, you might have noticed that I virtually never look at the directional arrows to see which direction I need to turn that turret. Reason being, I learned a method many years ago. In fact, I don't even remember where I learned this. Might have been in sniper training, might have been somewhere else. And if you use this method, it will help avoid any confusion regarding which direction you need to turn in order to move the point of impact of your bullet the direction you want it to go. The way I do this is I don't think of my adjustment turrets as turrets at all. I think of them as bolts. And conveniently, this tool has a very large bolt to help illustrate this process. When I need to adjust my bullet's point of impact on the target, if it's an elevation change that I need to make, I think of my bullet sitting on top of my bolt, just like this. If I need the point of impact for my bullet to go down, I turn my bolt this direction, and the point of impact on the bullet will go down. If I need to raise the bullet's point of impact, I turn my bolt this direction, and that will raise the point of impact on the target. This is a very easy way to remember this, and I do something similar with my windage adjustments, and I'll show you how I do that right now. When I need to make a windage correction, I still think of my adjustment turret as a bolt, only now I imagine my bullet is attached to the end of the bolt. If I need the point of impact for my bullet to move to the left, I turn my bolt this direction. If I need my bullet's point of impact to go to the right, I turn my bolt this direction. This is a very easy way to remember which direction you need to turn your turret in order to move the point of impact for your bullet the direction you want it to go. It works very, very well. I have used this in competition for a long time. I've used it for virtually any time that I've needed to make a windage or elevation adjustment with my turrets. But there's something you need to be aware of. There are some scopes out there that are regulated differently than my bolt system. And particularly some years ago, there was an effort to have elevation adjustments turn the opposite direction for elevation and declination. I have no idea why that was. But before you start to use this method, make sure your scope is regulated properly for it to work. The last thing I want to get into today is first and second focal plane. This is another thing we hear a lot about these days, and what it refers to is where physically inside the scope the reticle is located. At the moment, you're looking through a rifle scope that has the reticle located in the second focal plane. The reason this is significant is because the reticle in the first focal plane will react differently when magnification is increased or decreased than a rifle scope with a reticle located in the second focal plane. I'm going to start to increase the magnification, and as I do so, you'll notice that the size of the reticle remains constant the entire time that I am magnifying the image and when I am reducing the magnification of the image. When we talk about the portion of the target that the reticle appears to cover, this is called subtension. So a second focal plane rifle scope, or maybe I should say a rifle scope with the reticle located in the second focal plane, will subtend different amounts of space on the target as the magnification changes. This also changes the way we can use that reticle, and I'll talk about this more when I get to the segment of this series where I'm talking about reticles. But in brief, if we're doing things such as range estimation or employing holes for elevation or windage or what have you, with the second focal plane scope, any indications on the reticle itself that are graduated in minutes of angle or mil are only true at one magnification power. Typically, that's the highest magnification power, which is where I have this scope set presently. On any other magnification, the elements in the target that you would use for elevation correction or windage correction or moving target leads or range estimation are not going to have the same value. I've now changed over to a rifle scope with the reticle located in the first focal plane, and this time as I increase magnification, you'll notice that the reticle also increases in size proportionately to the magnification. And as we get to the highest levels, you can see a lot of elements in the reticle that were not even visible at the lower magnification. And by the way, forgive the slightly out of focus look of the reticle. This is the best I can do with my camera right now, trying to get through the scope to be able to show you this. Another thing just to note here that I mentioned earlier is how when we get to the highest levels of magnification with some scopes, the image gets a little bit darker and you can see some of that darkening there. The thing that is advantageous when we're using a rifle scope with the reticle located in the first focal plane is that if we're going to be employing windage or elevation holes or moving target leads or estimating range or any of those functions, we always have the same relationship between the elements in our reticle and the target regardless of the magnification setting. So the takeaway here is that there are advantages and disadvantages both ways with first or second focal plane. If you're going to be shooting at a lot of unknown distances and you're going to be employing windage and elevation holds or moving target leads or estimating range, then the first focal plane probably is going to have some advantages for you in that type of shooting, especially if you're shooting at longer distances. On the other hand, as you can see now, when we turn to our lowest magnification with the first focal plane rifle scope, the reticle is very, very small, and this is the failing that I see with a lot of rifle scopes that have the reticle located in that first focal plane. When you go down to the lower magnifications, the reticle in some scopes becomes virtually unusable because it is just so tiny in there you can't see it. You almost have to turn the magnification up to some degree just to be able to see your reticle and be able to use it effectively. With the second focal plane rifle scope that I showed you a moment ago, since the reticle is always the same size, so long as you can see it at the lowest magnification power, you can see it at the highest magnification power, it's not going to change at all. So you don't have that issue with getting larger and smaller. And if you're going to be shooting from the bench at a known distance, if you just like to go out and set the rifle up and try to shoot the smallest groups you can, first or second focal plane is not going to make very much difference to you at all. For most hunters that are shooting at relatively close distances, if you're hunting in close cover and your longest shot is maybe 50 yards or 75 yards or something like that, first and second focal plane is going to make very little difference to you. For long-range shooters, particularly long-range tactical shooters, you may get some advantage from a rifle with the reticle located in the first focal plane, so long as you're actually going to use the elements in the reticle to perform the functions that I mentioned a moment ago. And that's going to do it for today's installment in the Riflescope 101 series. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments about this video, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, stop by my website, hrfunk.com, check out the news and information page to see all the latest things that are going on with me and the channel, and go by the products page because a lot of the products that I've reviewed here on the channel have links to the manufacturers on that page, and there's information underneath some of those links that'll save you some money if you decide to make a purchase. See you next time, folks. And until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.